You've made all these blocks. Now what? In this video, you'll get some tips for sewing together blocks that are the same size but made from different patterns. Below, you'll find the times that these topics appear in the video, so you can skip ahead if you like. First tip, do a little bit of planning before sewing. Planning ahead is the easiest to execute, but often overlooked. When sewing an individual block, you want to press for ease of construction so that your seams fit together nicely when matching intersections. But when all the blocks are different, this gets tricky. Look at the first two blocks in the bottom row. The pressing schemes don't match up. To sew, you'll end up with a lot of bulk on one side, and it's tough to sew through these 6 layers of fabric. Sometimes you can repress these seams to make it easier for matching. This seam was repressed in the opposite direction. Now these two seams can snuggle up against each other, and notice this bulk has been redistributed, making it easier to sew that perfect intersection. Paying attention to your layout can make a difference. You should try to eliminate intersections that need matching. Place blocks based on different grid systems next to each other. For example, look at this middle row. The center block is in a 3x3 grid. The other 2 blocks are part of a 1x2 grid. When these blocks get sewn together, there won't be any intersections needing to be matched. You only have to worry about these triangle points, and you'll get tips on how to sew these later in the video. Unfortunately, in this quilt, it's impossible to get totally away from like grid systems. Notice when the middle row gets sewn to the top and bottom, there's a block in the top row and the bottom row that have intersections that will have to be matched. Keep rearranging and you might find a better layout. Look at the bottom quilt. Same blocks in each row, but in different positions. In this arrangement, only one area has to be matched when you sew the 3 rows together. In a perfect world, all of these 6-inch blocks should end up being the same size, but often 1 or 2 blocks are smaller or larger than the pattern size. This happens to the best of quilters, so don't worry. You usually can fix this if the difference in size is 1/8 of an inch or smaller on these 6-inch blocks. If you have a block with rectangular shapes around the edge and it's too large, you can get by with trimming a little from the sides. If the block has points around the edges, this won't work as well, as you'll end up cutting off the tips when you sew. I've trimmed about 1/8 of an inch off this block. That's a 1/16 of an inch here and about a 1/16 of an inch here, just to make sure that this center matches up. This block was about 1/4 of an inch larger than this star block. It can be trimmed on the bottom because they're all rectangular shapes. You wouldn't want to trim up here on the top because eventually these points would get caught up in the seam allowance and get cut off when sewing this block to this block. You've just seen some ways to trim blocks, but this is not something I usually recommend, as it's easy to get carried away and trim off too much. Or in this case, you might end up trimming the block that's the correct size. In the next section, you'll learn a better way to get your blocks in line. Instead of cutting, you can use your feed dogs to get these blocks in line. If the difference is small, say a 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch on a 6-inch block, place the larger block on the bottom and the smaller on top. Line up on the ends and pin. Find the center and pin. Stitch a 1/4 inch seam. The feed dogs will distribute excess fabric when sewing. The excess fabric has been eased in from end to end. When sewing together blocks with triangle tips, you might have to use a scant or generous 1/4 inch seam allowance. Check out where the threads cross on the back. Find the intersection and move 1 thread over in this direction So from here to here, that's about 1/4 inch. So to ensure that I don't cut this tip off here, I'll want to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam. 1/4 inch seam is from my needle to the end of this foot. To sew a scant 1/4 inch seam, I'm about 1 thread over in this direction from that 1/4 inch mark. Looks good. Sometimes the pressing can cause problems. You can see that this looks like a very scant 1/4 inch seam. Actually, it's probably 3/8 of an inch seam. When I turn this over, you can see that the distance from here to the edge is almost 1/4 inch. Here's the intersection. Instead of sewing a thread over in this direction, I'll sew right through the middle of that intersection. And here's that point. In this case, there's very little distance from the tip to the edge. If you find that your tip is very close to the edge, you can come in and take a little tuck here, and you can see that if I just go maybe 2 threads over, that tip has gotten much further from the edge. So let me show you how I do this. Put right sides together, and I'm going to stitch on this side of that stitching line, just about a thread over. I started stitching about a thread over, and then I came back on to the original stitching line. And when I open this, you can see that the distance from here to the edge is about 1/4 inch. Put right sides together. I want to make sure that these seams match up. Come over here, right sides together, that matches up, and I'll pin. Because I stitched that little tuck here, this piece will end up being a little bit smaller. You'll see that there's some excess fabric here on the other piece. Usually your feed dogs will take care of this. I'm holding this with my stiletto, and you can see that this tip and intersection is matching, and this tip and intersection is matching. To match tip to tip, put right sides together and match this intersection. Sometimes I'll use a pin to line up those points. I want this pin right at the top of that point, and then I'll come in right at the top of this point, and holding that straight, I'll pin on this side, and then I'll pin on this side and remove that pin. Other times, I just like to eyeball where those two are going to meet up, and I can put a dab of washable glue right in here, but if I do that, I have to spend a little extra time holding on until it dries. So instead of using the glue, I'm just going to go back to pinning that area. So this is all lined up, but this doesn't look so good here on the end, and I'll have to make some adjustments. I'll move this to within about 1/16 from the edge and pin. I'll let my feed dogs distribute this excess fabric. Over here I have another tip that I have to pay attention to, but it's on the back side. It looks like this will be a scant 1/4 inch seam here. So I can stick a pin here as a reminder to sort of narrow that seam a little when I get to that point. I've got another problem down here. This basket block is a little short, so take this to the edge and I'll put a clip there. I'm ready to go. I'll use the point of my scissors to hold this in place when I pull out this pin. I'm coming up to this section where I need to sew a scant 1/4 inch. So let me take this pin out. I'll move this fabric back about a thread over, and I'll finish up at regular 1/4 inch mark. And here's my triangle points. At times, you'll end up having to sew through 6 or more layers of fabric when matching intersections. Now, I could press the seam in opposite direction to avoid bulk, but I've left it as is for this demonstration. I really dislike pinning, but when it comes to a bulky seam, I'll give in. Because there's so many layers here, the fabric tends to slip when being sewn. The feed dogs down here are pulling the bottom layer when they move, but the top layers aren't keeping in sync. The pins will help keep everything in place. Sometimes it helps to use your walking foot to keep these layers together, especially if you have a quilt with a lot of these bulky seams. These feet will keep in sync with the feed dogs on the bottom, keeping all those layers together. Another way of dealing with these bulky seams is to use the stiletto to hold everything in place. You sew slowly, and that tip can go right up to your needle. It really helps to hold everything in place. And there's my seam. When all the rows are completed, sew them together using the previous tips. Add borders. These are really big, but they match up to the quilt back or quilt top, however you look at it. Hope you find these tips useful. By the way, if you would like to make any of these blocks, you'll find links to free step-by-step videos and patterns below. You'll learn different beginner skills with each block. No time to search for fabric? Visit our shop where you'll find kits that include the fabric for these. Also, you might like to check out our next video, adding sashing to your blocks. You'll get some more pointers for sewing the blocks together into a finished top. So glad you visited learnhowtoquilt.com. Please share our videos with your friends. Don't forget to sign up for updates and free patterns at our website. Thanks.